time from our audience. And in the tradition of the Goldstein program, we'd like to begin with students. If we have students who have questions. Yes?
Yes. I'll have this as a general question to any of the speakers that'd like to respond. But it was questioned, why is the program camp essentially so successful? And there was a lot of good investigation into that. But from my perspective, you can see that organizations such as the NRA have 4 million members, which places them, besides political parties, as some of the largest activist groups in the entire nation. While also, comparatively, Mr. Bloomberg's name has been brought up several times in the presentation, as a lot of people in the consortium come from the Bloomberg Center at Johns Hopkins. He himself, though, instead of having millions of people to support him, has his millions of dollars and has created groups like Everytown for Gun Safety. So my question is, wouldn't the underlying reason behind why certain sides of the debate are performing more successfully be because one side actually has more genuine people supporting it instead of essentially just patrons throwing their wealth?
Thank you. Do we have another question from a student? Really?
I have more questions.
I'm sure you do. Okay, we have any other questions from audience members? Yes, in the back?
Yes. Could you speak or anyone speak to what degree guns and their manufacturer are big business, and to what degree they have increased sales? And also, I didn't hear any discussion about the implication of the new technologies, where you have people who have never picked up a gun who could shoot, the distance accurately the first time they ever picked up a gun, with the new kinds of technological guns that have come out of Texas, several ball fields away if they're targeted. And how do you think that impacts the discussion? And the other thing is, you did one of the most fantastic introductions of the panel I have ever heard. And I wish we could snipe your dad.
Thank you. He wishes he could be by Skype too, because he's a great storyteller. I don't know how well he'll like being a key example, but he was quite shocked to be interviewed by me, as was my brother this weekend as I was preparing.
It was wonderful.
Thank you very much. You're very kind. I'm sorry. Over here.
With as much as y'all talked about people and the people that are behind most of this violence, I was just wondering why such the emphasis on making sculptures of the firearms, and how that, just kind of why you chose to do the firearms to the people behind the violence.
Hey, is that for me?
Yeah.
Since I made them. So, could you just you want to know why I chose to make firearms?
Well, the rest of the panel mostly brought up how people are affected
Right.
and affect gun violence, and I'm just wondering why the choice to do firearms.
So,
The display of firearms is.
well, I can give you a few answers to that question. So first of all, for me, the origins of this were not just the mass shooting at Sandy Hook, but also in 1991, I actually made a series of weapons which were in response to the Gulf War. And I know that was a long time ago, probably a couple years before you were born, actually, not to be patronizing, but that's a long time ago, before the internet, cell phones, blah, blah, blah. But it was the first time that weapons were actually being shown on television. They were called smart bombs, and they were flying down chimneys and blowing up camps in Iraq. And so I made all these weapons because, for me, again, it was like kind of a sculptural response to something. I wanted people to see something that was kind of violent, but at the same time, very much just an object. And I made all these medieval-looking weapons that were weapons like maces and axes and swords. And again, they were made out of found materials like bowling balls and antlers and chains and bike parts. And anyway, so I made these things, laid them out in a gallery, had a show in Washington, had another show in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. In fact, some of the pieces were sold to people who were NRA gun collectors on a trip to Washington. They also had little tags on them. Each tag was a weapon system, like the Tomahawk and the B1 and the M16. And so it's sort of like taking this medieval object and making it sort of high-tech looking. Does that make sense? So when Sandy Hook happened, I went into my storage trailers, which I have 4 behind my studio that are like 40 feet long. One of them has 200 of the unsold weapons in them, and pulled a couple of machine guns out. I was like, this is kind of weird. The same story. 22 years later, here I am making guns out of stuff. And I guess like my response as an artist was like, well, this is a different story, and it's a domestic story rather than an international defense policy story. And I kind of like latched onto this again, because as an artist, I think, you know, my impulse is not to write a paper, it's to make something, right? So I think I was really wrestling with what it meant to own a Bushmaster gun or an AK-47 or an M16. So I started making those things as I suggested in my opening or my comment over there. And I think, you know, you delve into this place, which is a pretty dark place. If you've ever actually like owned a gun, or do you own a gun?
Yes.
So do you have a couple?
Yes.
And what's your relationship with your gun like?
I think that they're intricate pieces of machinery that are fascinating.
Right. And do you think about the lethality of the gun that you own?
Yeah, because I use them to hunt as well, and I think about stalking power and stuff like that.
But you've never shot a person with your gun.
No, I don't intend to.
Right, you don't tend to.
You're on
and that's,
camera. You're on camera.
No, you're not, actually. They're all pointing this way. So I guess my point is that, like, that with these guns that I made, I was really trying to kind of like conjure that thing, what it means to make a lethal object, even though I wasn't making a real gun. So I was kind of just trying really hard to sort of get in the mindset of not just manufacture, but like creativity and all that like surrounds that. And it's kind of like it's almost like something you do when you're exercising, you know, you sort of like get into that mode of gun maker, right? So anyway, that was my idea, like how do I get my head around this subject? So does that answer the question? Maybe?
Thanks, Amy. I want to try to get at some of the other questions
Okay,
that were in
sorry.
front of us, and then we'll move back to another round of questions. Can we first start with this young man's question about explaining the success of the NRA?
So I think I want to start by, and I'll disagree just a little bit with what you're saying. But I think that the NRA, for many years, you know, was up to 1977, was pretty much of a hunting group, and then became, in the famous Cincinnati Revolt, became taken over by people who were much more interested in politics. And, you know, for many years had a very strong structural advantage, which is they had a network of about 50,000 gun stores and gun shows recruiting people on a daily basis. And before the internet, that was a pretty powerful, you know, advantage, structural advantage. So they had, and they do, they have a lot of members. What I think has happened over the last decade, really accelerated in the last 3 or 4 years, is that small groups like mine have lots more members than we ever had before. But if you look at, as you mentioned, Everytown actually has about 2 million members now. So it is true that it's true that Mayor Bloomberg has has money and he spent it politically. And it's also true that a lot of the NRA members aren't really paid members either. So I think you have to be careful when you challenge Bloomberg on that. So the money now has become equalized. So you have lots of people now who've been able to be joined by direct email, Facebook, Twitter, etc. You've got political equality and money spent on candidates. And you see things that were unthinkable just a few years ago. And I would go to the Washington referendum, where in Washington State, by ballot referendum, the people supported a background check law overwhelmingly, I think over somewhere around 60%. And that was a really exciting moment because that's the people got to vote. We got the issue to the people. So a lot of times, you know, you have in Washington, you have a filibuster which stops a lot of things. And I think you have to look at sort of the quality of the laws being passed as well. Background check law in Washington is much more important than a tinkering with a small piece of concealed carry law. So I think, and then of course, in 2016, it appeared there is a ballot referendum in Nevada on background checks. So there is things that were unthinkable that are happening. And of course, since Sandy Hook, you know, there's been a lot of changes in places like Colorado, Washington, and other places for laws that I think do a better job of restricting people who shouldn't have firearms. So I actually think that the pendulum is changing in a very different way. I think the gun violence prevention movement has real grassroots and is equalizing that of the NRA. I think, you know, 5 or 6 years ago, the NRA had a much stronger grassroots component, and I think that's why you're seeing things starting to swing the other way. It will take some time, but what's going on right now between the equalization of the political and the equalization of the activism, I think bodes well for the type of reforms that I'm advocating for.
Listen, you have something about the environment.
A couple of things that strike me. One, to Jeff's point, I would point out, though, that not every state has initiatives, right? The ability for citizens to actually bypass state legislatures. Some states like Maryland have referendums and those sorts of things. So I think that you're raising a good point that these ballot initiatives, when they come up, have been successful, because I think most Americans support what we might call reasonable gun control laws, or reasonable restrictions on getting access to guns. But you have to say with the NRA, I mean, the hat's off to the NRA in terms of their political organizational skills. I mean, they really are quite effective. I've looked at studies of rankings of interest groups at state legislatures, and by far, the NRA is often near the top of the list, because they do have an active base of people who are hunters, who are gun enthusiasts, people who shoot. You know, there's a big rise in interest in shooting sports, for example. That's not to say, though, that there isn't a large percentage of Americans who actually would support more reasonable limits on access to guns. But there's a phenomenon that many political scientists often point to. It's often easier to organize people with a very focused and narrow interest than it is to organize the general public. So a good example would be consumers, right? No one likes to pay more for things that they don't want to, but how do you organize consumers at large, rather a narrow industry that can talk to regulators, that can talk to individual members of Congress, that kind of knows a very narrow piece of legislation. So I think sometimes you just can't confuse raw numbers with effectiveness in American politics. That would be my point on that.
Well,
I'm sorry, I just want to proceed with the questions that we had before us, and I promise I'll come back to you. There was a question about legality and technology, and I don't know if we have any armaments experts who can talk about.
So I do think about that a fair amount. I've been interviewed on that many times. I think what you're referring to is actually GPS systems now in firearms. I think that's a problem as far as sort of in a very narrow category of, you know, political assassinations and things like that. It's too expensive at the moment to go into the general public. So those weapons are out there, and I think law enforcement is concerned about those, but at the moment they're about $20,000, so they're not sort of going to be on the street every day. However, there is a technology issue with a lot of issues. One of the big issues is that the industry continues to innovate for legality, but doesn't do so for safety. And I think it's unfortunate. A lot of people think the industry controls the NRA and the gun lobby. I have a different view. I think that there are members in the industry who would very much like to make safety improvements to their firearms. For instance, incorporating locks into the design of their firearms, biometric locks, things like that. But there is a huge price to pay. We've seen gun retailers who wanted to sell this one company that makes these really being punished and threatened. So I think that we should embrace, I would hope at some point, there's a lot of great technology out there, safety technology, that impacts, the kids, child access, suicide access. I think those things we could really make a big difference in technology, and I would like to think that the industry will eventually start innovating for safety as well as legality.
Herman, did I speak to you? Did you have something about?
Not about that issue.
Okay. I had 3 hands up. Professor Ryan.
I'm going to stand so people can hear me. I would do this
quickly if I can, 5 terms. Free speech, gun rights, technology, responsibility. One of the big problems in American culture seems to me is the uncoupling, facing more and more people, of responsibility from rights. And I think that one of the things that's most important in our schools, grammar schools, colleges, all over the place, is to really, whenever we talk about rights with people, young people especially, to bring the notion of responsibility right into the context every time. Our rights should be attenuated by a sense of responsibility. I myself, I was in the Marines. I'm very good with a rifle. I got very big medals for marksmanship from 1,000 feet away and all that. I was responsible. I wasn't in a war, thank heavens. But I think, we go back to the technology. Think of the internet, the way the internet is used. It's a wonderful instrument in so many ways. But think of the people who are being scandalized or being all kinds of lies thrown at them. And the way in which they can multiply by the technology we have. The technology we get off these guns. Nice hitting guns, get really and so on. So anyway, that's the scramble of things, and I could go on and spend a whole hour talking about it, but I think connecting responsibility with emphasis of rights is absolutely crucial. We are ever to recover our sanity and exposure.
Mr. Daly.
Thank you. I was struck by the slide which indicated that in states, correct me if I misunderstood, states that adopted universal background checks had a 48% reduction in suicides. What are the specific questions or checks or mechanisms that they're doing that produce that result? I know, for example, in Maryland, and on the federal level, when one fills out the various forms, they don't ask if you're suicidal. And they don't pose those questions generally to members of the medical community who treat people who might fall into that category. So how was it they got that result?
Well, I mean, there's still a lot of studies on that, so it's not 100% clear, right? So there's 2 things that are going on. Those states not only have fewer firearms, but not only have they have better gun laws, but they have fewer firearms too. So you definitely have those things going on. But in a state, so they don't ask that question in Maryland, but they check their database. And states who have put a lot in the last couple of years, a lot of states have put disqualifying mental illness records into their background check system. For instance, when Connecticut did that, you could see a direct drop-off in violence among that population. When they put their record, they have a universal background check. So when they put their records in, you saw a direct reduction of violence among that population, of gun violence in that population. So, you see the effects of those things, although you might not be asked that question, those are in the database. But